2, 1. And we're live. Today's guest is Dr. Miriam Berchuk. Thank you for joining us. Yeah, good morning. And thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to do this. I really appreciate it. Why don't we start with just give us your background and a bit of kind of what you're into.
So I'm an anesthesiologist. I practice at the Rocky View Hospital in Calgary. I'm 13 years into practice. So this is around the time, I think, when people start to, you settled in, you're a middleman, you settled into your career, you're feeling very comfortable. And sometimes this is where people start to develop outside interests. So that certainly is the case for me. I developed an interest in nutrition and on the effect of our food choices on our health. So I specifically became interested in what's called a low-carb, high-fat diet. We call it LCHF for short. And that was back in 2017, so almost 2 years ago, a year and a half ago. No, I'm sorry, that's not right, 2016.
Okay.
So it's been well over 2 years. My whole life, really from the time I was a child, I had always been chubby, had struggled with my weight. And I tried all sorts of different diets, everything from paid-for diets where you would go in and you'd buy your frozen meals to I'd done things like count calories. I'd done things like eating very clean, nothing but steamed veggies and chicken breast. I'd done all those things. And what I found for me personally was that it was always fairly easy to take the weight off. But then once I hit the weight I was happy with, the weight would creep back on. And then as it crept back on, I would get more and more frustrated and then I would kind of eat more, and then it would just get out of control. So I had suffered with that for most of probably from my early 20s to my early 40s.
Well, I had a similar, we were talking a little bit about it before this, but I was in a similar boat where I think I just grew up on a lot of bad sweets and different things, and my dad didn't love cooking, and so he would order pizza a lot and stuff, and so I put on quite a bit of weight when I was younger. And I think, to your point, it is easier to get it off. It's harder to keep it off.
That's right.
So maybe let's get into that. How does that kind of work?
So interestingly, I just 2 weeks ago wrote my exam in obesity medicine. It's an American board exam. And I learned a lot. It was fascinating. But what I learned is that a huge amount of our genome is actually dedicated to maintaining our weight. So we have a set point. And the term they use is defending your set point. So you can imagine that over time, so right now we live in a food environment where there's just food everywhere. But for most of our existence, hundreds of thousands of years and millions of years, food was scarce. And so what is the most, following breathing, breathing is probably the most important thing, getting in oxygen.
Right.
But then number two would be making sure that you've got adequate, if you don't have access to food, then you've got a source of, you've got your fuel reserves, let's say, so that would be fat. So our body's ability to store fat and to make sure that even in periods of scarcity, that we've got adequate fuel reserves. So our brain is very, very, manages this very closely. And so I learned about concepts when I was studying for my exam, about concepts like, because we're taught, so to take a step back, we talked about this briefly just before. If you want to lose weight, you just have to, eat fewer calories and burn more calories. Right. But the fact is that, especially if you do that drastically, and the biggest loser is a very interesting, we can talk about that after, it's a very interesting example of that. But when you do that drastically, so if you drastically cut your calories and you drastically increase your output, your brain is going to start to find ways to decrease how many calories you burn and to increase your appetite, because the brain is screaming, what is going on here? Right. And is trying to get you back to that set point that it has figured out for you. So there are concepts like, so obviously there's, our energy expenditure. So what's just our basal metabolic rate? That can shift, that can drop. So if you cut calories too much and your body starts to sense that, it can drop your basal metabolic rate, or your resting energy expenditure is the technical term. The other thing is things like there's a term for something that's called non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So that's things like fidgeting or just kind of getting up and moving, or you're thinking, oh, I want to get up and get a glass of water. So it's not physical exercise. It's not your basal metabolic rate or your resting energy expenditure, but just how much do you move? And that actually is responsible for a fair amount of energy that you burn during a day. So if your brain is sensing that you're getting inadequate calories, it's going to ramp that down. You're going to fidget less, you're going to move less, you're just going to tend to be more still, burn fewer calories. Your muscles get more efficient. So if you're taking in fewer calories, your muscles actually get more efficient at burning. So they use fewer calories to do whatever you need to do. Right. So your brain and it's not only brain, it's brain, muscles, gut. All these things get highly efficient. If you start to eat less, well, your energy expenditure is gonna drop. And then there's the other side. Well, you're eating less. Well, now there are going to be all sorts of signals to your brain to eat more. I'm hungry. I don't feel satisfied after a meal. I'm having cravings. So that was what I would say for me would be previously whenever I had lost weight, I would start to have these intense cravings that I just felt that were in control of me. And that is really, now that I've learned more about it, is the brain's way of trying to get that weight back on, trying to get you back up to your set point. So I would say that the scientists don't, those who are studying this don't understand exactly what it is that sets your set point. And how do you budge? How do you move that set point? And how long, if you've achieved a new set point, or if you've dropped your weight to a certain level, how long does it take for that to become your new set point, to sort of reset your set point? And it's interesting because they'll do studies where they'll overfeed people. So they take healthy people who, let's say, healthy young guy, his weight's 180 pounds, and they overfeed. And that person gains weight, so they're now 200 pounds. Leave them alone, and over the next weeks to months, they'll just naturally come right back down to 180.
Interesting.
So because that's not their set point. So in these overfeeding studies, it's actually difficult to get people to put on weight. And the same is true the opposite. You get people to kind of drop weight and they come back up to their set point. So the big question is, how do you drop set point? And I'm a fan of the low-carb, high-fat diet. Right. And I would say, so one of the people who's very active is a Canadian nephrologist. His name is Dr. Jason Fung. Yep. He's based in Toronto. He's written a book called The Obesity Code, and he believes that the way you reset the set point is by dropping your insulin levels.
Interesting.
So, and that's the beauty of low carb, high fat, is I think people recognize that, eating 100 calories of broccoli is very different than eating 100 calories of chips. And they would say, well, that's different because broccoli has minerals, or it's got vitamins, or it's got fiber. But chips, 100 calories of broccoli has a very different effect on your insulin than 100 calories of chips. You don't get the insulin spike. So insulin is a hormone that is secreted in response to your body sensing that there's food in the gut. And, whether it's so food is really kind of falls into three classifications. There's carbohydrate, there's protein, and there's fat. And carbohydrate produces the biggest insulin surge, and insulin secreted by the pancreas. So you get the biggest insulin surge with carbohydrate, you get a smaller one with protein, and you get virtually no insulin surge with fat. So if you're trying to get your insulin levels low, the key is going to be try to eat foods that don't spike your insulin. So that's keeping your carbohydrates low, keeping your fats high, and then giving your body time, because insulin will spike after a meal. So giving your body time, just periods of non-eating, where your insulin can really kind of drop down to normal. And so Jason Fung would say that's how you reset a set point, is by moving to a diet that doesn't spike your insulin quite so much. And then there are other advantages. We're starting to learn. So there are all these diseases of modern civilization: heart disease, high blood pressure, dementia, Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, obesity. These are diseases that didn't exist 100 years ago. And I think that's partly that in our modern food environment, we're constantly eating. So you look at the average Canadian, most of our food's going to come from carbohydrates. So most of our calories, I'm going to say 50 to 60% comes from carbohydrates. And they're usually not whole food carbohydrates. They tend to be carbohydrates either from sugars, pure sugars, refined grains, what we call ultra-processed foods. So those are foods that, come in a box that have this shelf life of several years, where there's, the ingredient list is 10 or 12 different things. So that's where most calories for Canadians come from these days, certainly for Canadian children. So So if the majority of our calories are coming from carbohydrates, our insulin levels are going to be high. And then there's also the fact that we're constantly eating. So I would have done, I was into fitness, you were into fitness, you were told, you got to keep the engine burning. It's important to snack. You always have to be eating. You can't let otherwise your energy drops. So, people start off, they have breakfast. So what's breakfast? Well, it's probably the most high carb meal for Canadians. So it's a bowl of cereal, it's a sweetened yogurt, it's a bagel,
Toast,
bagel and toast, and then there's mid-morning, there's a snack. And then of course there's the sweetened coffees. So I go into Starbucks now, and now that I'm low carb, I look around, I think, how much sugar are these people just drinking? So the sugars you're drinking are even worse because of the way they're processed in the liver. But you got your caramel macchiato in the morning with a muffin, and then lunch is going to be a sandwich. Dinner's going to have a starch. It'll have a rice or a potato, and then there's the late night snacking. There's the people sitting in front of the TV and so very, very high carb. So I would say that we're eating more calories. Certainly we're eating more calories than we used to, but we're eating a lot more carbs, and especially we're not talking about lentils and beans. We're talking about refined carbs, ultra processed foods, a lot more of those. So we are never allowing our insulin levels to drop.
And so what would so you're saying low carb, high fat. What is there? I know there's diets out there. Like, is there a name you can put to that diet? Or
I call it the low carb. I'm really particular. So I call it low carb, high fat. I'd like to specify that, I'm not the kind of low carb, high fat that I recommend is going to be a whole foods diet. So these are all foods, again, that, they don't come in boxes. If you leave them on your counter, they go bad. So they're whole foods. And then low carb, high fat is really a spectrum. So at the very, very lowest end would be, so if we're talking about number of grams of carbs per day, would be maybe 20 or 30 grams of carbs per day. And when your carbs are that low, you end up, your primary fuel source, you end up burning a lot of fat, and then you end up developing what are called ketones. There's if you were to take a blood test, you would have ketones. So people will call that a ketogenic diet.
Sure.
And the number of grams of carbs is really going to differ. Everyone, it's different, especially if you're very physically active, you can eat more carbs. But that's a ketogenic diet at the very, very low end of the spectrum. Moderate would be about 50 grams of carbs per day. A liberal low-carb, high-fat diet would be probably about 100 to 125 grams of carbs a day. That's where I personally am. I'm metabolically healthy, and we can talk about that after. But that's kind of where I sit. So in a liberal LCHF diet, there's room for a little bit of fruit, a little bit of legumes, a little bit of beans, a little bit of starchy vegetables, so like yams and beets. So in the summer, when the Okanagan fruit is out, I will eat the peaches. I'll enjoy some corn, some Tabor corn. But those are not foods, cherries, but those are not foods that I eat every day. On the more strict end of the spectrum, what we would call, strict low carb or keto, those foods are really have too much carbohydrate. And I recommend, when I'm talking to people about this diet, I always ask them, what are your goals? And what are your health issues? And so do you want to just drop a little weight? Is there diabetes in your family? Did you have diabetes in your pregnancy? Is there heart disease? Are you on medicine for high blood pressure? And do you want to choose a therapeutic nutrition approach where we start to look at choosing foods that are going to improve our health? And so, the very, very low end of the spectrum, the ketogenic end of the spectrum, is really only necessary in people. Well, the most well-known one is for people with seizures, especially children with seizures that haven't responded well to medications. So that's the most well-known use of a ketogenic diet. But now we're starting to see that for people with diabetes, type 2, I should clarify, type 2 diabetes, who want to get off their insulin medications, who want to drop their other medications, that a very low-carb diet can help them do that. Now, a liberal low-carb diet, depending on what they're eating already, can probably help them as well. So it's just a question of degree. How much carbohydrate are you willing to cut out in order to get healthier?
Now, are you measuring your ketones all the time?
I'm not, and I don't think there's any value in that.
Interesting.
So keto, we were talking earlier about fat. So keto's gotten very popular. A lot of people out there say they're doing keto. I don't think they're actually doing keto. So people have just thrown this word keto around, whatever, and I think some of these people are probably liberal low carb calling it keto. Sure. So I'm very specific in my terminology. A lot of these people are doing bulletproof coffee, so
Right.
they're coffee with their MCT oil
With
and their
butter,
butter,
yeah.
and they're peeing
You hear
on
a lot
sticks.
about it. Yeah.
You do. So that's not the low carb, high fat that I advocate for. I mean,
Interesting.
why drink unless you really love that? If you love that,
Butter in
you
the
know, if you
morning, yeah.
love that, that's a drink you really enjoy, and it's going to replace a meal for you. Maybe. I mean, do I think you're better off having whole foods with all the vitamins and minerals and fiber that comes with? Yes. But I don't think these bulletproof coffees, and they're a source of a huge number of calories. So I think people believe that on a low carb, high fat diet, calories don't matter, and that's not the case.
Interesting.
Calories are always going to matter. What I believe is the huge benefit, so versus other diets that I've tried in the past, the huge benefit I find of low carb, high fat diets is this dropping of insulin. And along with that too comes this dropping of cravings, and an increased satiety. So people just feel full and have less appetite and aren't hungry. So I generally eat 2 meals a day. Sometimes I eat 1 meal a day,
Right.
because I feel that, what you do with this part of a low carb, high fat diet is just eating when you're hungry and learning to pay attention to hunger cues. And so if I'm not hungry, I don't eat. So I'm naturally eating fewer calories a day.
Is that considered intermittent fasting, or is that a totally different
Yeah,
concept?
so I like, again, like in terms of terminology, I call that time-restricted feeding or time-restricted eating. And then I use the term intermittent fasting for anything longer. So when you start getting into fasts that are 24 or 48 hours, I call that intermittent fasting. Anything within a day, I call that time-restricted feeding.
What's your thoughts on intermittent fasting? Because I know that's, again,
So on the
sort of-
longer,
right.
So I think time-restricted feeding has been shown. There's all this evidence
Okay.
coming that there's great health benefits. And the interesting thing too is, where is your eating window? So people talk about, what they call 16-8, or I'm gonna have to get my math right here, or 14-10. So, you fast or you don't eat so I do 16-8, let's say. So I fast for 16 hours, then I eat all my meals within an 8-hour window.
Interesting.
And there's definitely benefits to that. We know that for sure. And then where is your eating window? So the evidence is showing that when the eating window is earlier in the day, you tend to, there's again more weight loss. So you take 2 groups of people, feed them the exact same calories, give one group the calories from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. That's an 8-hour window. Give the other group those same calories from noon to 8 p.m. The second group is going to gain more weight, or their weight.
Interesting.
So it's, when are you eating your food? And our bodies are not meant to be eating late in the evening.
Yeah.
We should be sleeping, right? It's dark. You think hundreds of thousands of years ago, there was no, other than fire, we were, we weren't awake, we weren't doing anything, we were sleeping, we should not be eating.
Right.
And as for intermittent fasting, longer fasts, I would say within the low carb, high fat community, there's a lot of debate. Do you start with fasts that start to get beyond 48 hours? Do you start to burn your own muscle in order to get this? So, do you move from burning fat to burning muscle?
Right.
And are there ways to counteract that? Sure, resistance exercise, but for the average person, should they be doing longer fasts? I don't know. Dr. Jason Fung is a huge fan of them, and I believe he's got research, or he's going to hopefully be publishing research looking at because he does this a lot with his patients, but looking at their muscle mass and seeing if it changes over time.
So how did society, it just feels like society is so far off, what you're talking about. Like, how did we get here? And how do we shift back, right? You've talked about this, and when we first met, when you said to me therapeutic nutrition, I just thought, like, that is so, usually when you go in, to talk to someone, it's like, what do you want to do? Do you want to lose weight, or do you want to build muscle? Yeah. It's like, there's like a couple options, or lose weight and build muscle. Yeah. It's never like these questions you're talking about.
So my question always is, well, what is your health? What are your goals? Because there's no point coming up with a plan for someone if it's not something they're interested in sticking to. So adherence to any way of eating or diet is the most important thing. What is someone going to do that they're going to be able to adhere to long term? Because losing weight and keeping it off for a year or two and then gaining it all back is of no use. In fact, it might be detrimental. So what can people adhere to? So you asked, how did we get here? And I would say it probably started with women joining the workforce, because there was always someone at home doing the cooking. Women joined the workforce, and suddenly there was a need for prepared food. So that is really, when you look at our food environment, there's a lot of prepared food. So I'm certainly not saying, I would not be the person to say women should be getting back in the kitchen. Or that, and it's hard for most families these days. I think that is the big problem is people do not have the time to cook. They've lost the skills. It's not a part of their daily lives. And so we are just grabbing food on the go. And when you grab food on the go, it's generally going to be higher in, I mean, these are, again, so the list of ingredients is very, very long. What are the effects of those ingredients on our body? We don't know. These are not things that our bodies recognize as food. So what are the long-term effects on our microbiome, the gut and our bacteria? We don't know. What are the long-term effects on our set point? We don't know. So our food environment has changed so dramatically that and then it's not only the food environment, but it's all the marketing that comes across, all the constant barrage. You sit down, you watch TV, every 10 minutes you're being, there's some other kind of oozy, drippy, delicious, food. So there's, I think I read a really interesting book years ago by Michael Moss called Fat, Sugar, Fat, Salt, I think it was called. But these foods have been engineered to hook us.
Just like social networks to
hook
us to,
exactly the
it's
same.
Totally the same.
And I don't know if for social networks, if they're putting people in PET scanners and scanning their brains and watching their brain centers light up, but they're certainly doing that for food. So, they're tweaking their chips over and over and over to get maximum dopamine, our pleasure hormone, our neurotransmitter released from the brain. So that these foods have been engineered to be addictive. And so it is very difficult to turn back to a whole foods diet or to make whole foods a majority of your diet when you've been hooked on those foods. They taste delicious and they've been engineered to bring you back. And there's also this, it's like, what's that, I bet you can't eat just one. There's this, it kind of overrides your sense of fullness. And so in a way that if you sit down and have a whole foods meal, it's hard to overdo it. You can't overdo it on lentils or on fish or on steak or on, some people can overdo it on dairy, but it's hard to overdo it on those foods. It's very easy to overdo it on pizza or on pre-made lasagna or on chips. I mean, how often do you look down and you've eaten the whole bag of chips? So that is, I think, that's how we've gotten here.
Yeah.
So the question is now, how do we go back?
Totally.
And I would say, from my personal point of view, I can't change the food environment as much as I would love to. There are so there's, very strong lobbies at work that are working to keep things the same. There's a senator who's got a bill before the Senate who is trying to reduce advertisements to children. And I don't know if it's just sugar-sweetened beverages or just all ads, but is not making much headway. There's a very, very strong pushback from the lobbyists trying to prevent that bill from going through. So, and then
I'm always shocked, by the way, just quickly, about the use of children in these commercials for McDonald's, for Subway, for whatever, these fake foods, really.
They get them hooked early.
Yeah, they get them hooked early. And then my other favorite is that they let, Coca-Cola be the sponsor of like the Olympics.
Yes.
And you're like, how does that make any sense? And to me, they should start looking at it. I get it. There's lobbies. My understanding is obesity causes more death than smoking, than drunk driving, than...
Yes.
So it's like, we should talk about the thing that's really killing everyone, right? Which is what you're talking about. So these kind of bills, it seems so...
But then you get these conflicting messages like, well, if you just move more. So Coke, they were doing this in the U.S. And then there was recently, I think it was a New York Times story on how they're doing the same. They're funding scientists in China to come out with studies to say, well, if you just exercise more. So that's, I don't know what Coke's, because I try to ignore all that, but Coke's newest thing is more about being active. And so you can have a Coke, but just get out there and be active.
Yeah.
But, who has a tiny little Coke too? We've got people drinking several liters a day of these drinks.
Yeah.
So, the food environment is going to be very difficult to change. People's lives are busy.
Totally.
So how do you get people back in? And this is the newest Canada's Food Guide. Talks about people acquiring food skills, getting back in the kitchen, starting to cook more, starting to eat as a family, eating out less. These are all really important concepts. But no one's paying for all of that. So, you got these very well-funded lobbies on the one side, and then you've got people saying, well, just trying to teach, who's funding programs where we're teaching people to get back in the kitchen, or who's making healthy foods affordable. When I go to the grocery store, or you can stop at McDonald's, you can get a full meal for $5. Try making a healthy meal for $5, much more difficult. So
tricky.
We talked briefly before we started about grass-fed meat. And these are things that are not accessible for the average Canadian. We have to think about, what the average Canadian can afford, how much of their budget is actually available for food when they've got, once they've paid for the roof over their head and anything else, how much is available for food, and are healthy foods available or affordable? Yeah. And people would say they aren't.
That's one of the things I see with young people a lot, is that like I love cooking. I'm obsessed with cooking. I love just going and getting, fresh vegetables, to the point where when I'm down in California, I can taste the difference between the vegetables they have there and the vegetables we get up here, and the meat they have down there versus up here, because all of ours, comes from Mexico or California. It takes maybe 2 weeks to get here, right? And who knows when they pick it? It's probably still, totally, green. And a lot of my friends have no idea how to cook, and I'm not young. I'm 28. I wouldn't say I'm young, and from 18, 19 to my age, even friends I have that are older than me who don't like cooking. And that it disappoints me, because I find, for me, it's like, I love the creativity in it. It's like an expression of me, right? And I think if more people got into it, I think they'd start to really think, wow, I can make that McDonald's burger with my own ingredients. Like, that's my favorite, is taking something that you've had at a restaurant or whatever and trying to make it yourself, but with like better, real kind of ingredients. So, how would you, let's say it's someone who has tried a lot of these diets before, hasn't really had success, and it's probably a lot of them, it's keeping it off. Yeah. Where does someone start? I mean, obviously nutritionists are probably your best.
Registered dietitians?
Well,
I mean, I think, registered dietitians have an obligation to some extent. Now, there's this new Canada's Food Guide. I mean, I would say...
Like, where do you start? That's what I mean, like, as a layman person.
Well, I think, where do you start? So you're saying someone who wants to eat healthier or lose weight or...
Do what you're talking about with the low carb.
Okay, so an LCHF diet. Well, I think, first of all, for anyone, I think, most people, if they want to get healthier, there's some simple things. And I think in terms of moving the needle, that's the biggest thing. So can you cut out the sugars? And you got to be careful, because there's sugars everywhere. Obviously dessert, there's sugar, but there's sugar in there's beer. Right. Beer and wine, but I'm talking about actual, sugars. Added sugars. So there's added sugar in spaghetti sauce. There's added sugar in yogurt. There's added sugar, obviously, in cereals. So you have to start reading. I would say you have to start reading labels. And everybody looks at calories. And the interesting thing is, when I went LCHF, I haven't looked at calories in over 2 years, but I look at the number of grams of carbs if I'm buying something out of a box. And so I would say for most people, so cutting out the sugars and watching your sugars, cutting out the refined grains. So these are things like rice, brown rice or white rice. It's still rice. Now, brown rice has a bit more fiber, has less of a, the glycemic index is slightly lower, but it's still a refined grain.
Right.
A refined grain is something it's been processed, and it's had I'm trying to remember, the grains have 3 parts to them. There's like the outer husk and the inner germ.
Right.
And the minute you start refining them, you get a much bigger insulin surge with them. So cut out pasta, bread, rice, potatoes, the beige, I call them the beige things. So cut out sugars, cut out the refined grains, cut out the ultra-processed foods. So anything comes in a box that's got more than 4 or 5 ingredients, out. And that is, you're going to move the needle. So then essentially you're living on a whole foods diet. And I think for most people, that's a great start. Now, if you're someone that's interested in low carb, high fat, then you're going to have to start thinking about carbohydrates. So where do the carbohydrates? So in addition to cutting out all the beige stuff.
I was just going to say, what do you replace that stuff with if you love those things?
Well, you start replacing it with fat. So if I'm not a big tracker, I don't track, but when I have tracked on one of these apps, it was kind of shocking to people, but I eat about 10% of my calories, 5 to 10% come from carb. And for me, that would be mostly, I don't eat a lot of fruit, so my carbs mostly come from a little bit of dairy, from nuts and from vegetables, where my carbs come from, because nuts and vegetables have carbs too. Right. I eat about 15 to 20% of what I eat is protein, and then the rest, so I've come up, so that's about 70% is fat. So I'm on a high fat diet. Now my fats are all healthy fats. So they're dairy fat, they're fats from meat. So I don't cut the fat off my steak. I eat my chicken thigh with the skin on. I love chicken wings, just made on the barbecue with a bit of salt and pepper. So dairy fat, meat fat, nut fat, avocado fat, olive oil, butter, those kinds of fats. So
what kind of butter?
I just use regular butter.
Regular butter.
Grass-fed butter is really expensive.
Yeah, but not Baicel, not any of that.
No, Baicel's not butter. Baicel's margarine.
Right.
It's a hydrogenated oil.
So it's bad.
Yeah. Bad. So that's what I grew up on. I grew up on margarine.
So did I.
Stick to butter.
Okay.
So
unsalted, salted, doesn't matter? What do you do?
Either. Doesn't matter.
But real butter.
Butter. Okay. So I cook. So what's interesting is that you take a vegetable. So if you would have steamed your snap peas normally, not very appetizing, kind of cook them up with a bit of butter, put some salt on them, delicious. Yeah. So that little bit of being given the permission, this is what I found, is that when I went low carb, high fat, being given the permission to add fat to foods suddenly makes them more delicious. So, the fat helps satisfy. So, you feel full and you feel satisfied, but it's also tastier. So, the fact that I can sit down and have a big bowl, big bowl of chicken wings and a big green salad for dinner doesn't feel like I'm on a diet. I'll cook up, chicken thighs in a creamy balsamic dressing, creamy balsamic sauce, using whipping cream. It feels more satisfying. So it doesn't feel like a diet, which is very different than anything I'd ever done before. And that's where I think low carb, high fat can, and I don't think low carb, high fat is the diet for everybody. I certainly don't. Right. But I do think that a lot of people who've been taught to fear fat, who just look at this and think that's crazy. How can 70% of your calories come from fat, and how can that be healthy? I think there's a role that this low carb, high fat actually in bringing down insulin and in decreasing appetite and in decreasing cravings and in eating really delicious food can be a very sustainable way to lose weight and keep weight off. And that's why I've become such an advocate for it, is I want people to know it's an option. Yeah. And I certainly don't think it's the option for everybody, but I think it can really work for people. And where I think it has medical benefit is in people with what's called insulin resistance, which is where we don't really know what is the source of insulin resistance. That's still up for debate. Is it that your whole life you've eaten too many foods that have spiked your insulin? Is there a genetic predisposition? It's probably a combination of those things. Is it that your body is carrying more fat than it's comfortable with, and then you develop insulin resistance? We don't have an answer yet, but people with insulin resistance, so that's whether they have prediabetes, diabetes, a lot of hypertension is related to insulin resistance, polycystic ovarian syndrome, a lot of Alzheimer's disease we believe now. So if you've got Alzheimer's in your family, some heart disease, all these are things. Irritable bowel syndrome responds really well to a low carb, high fat diet. So all these syndromes or medical illnesses can respond very well to a low carb, high fat diet, and I think it's something people should be offered. And you asked about nutritionists. I mean, in Canada, the official designation is a registered dietitian, and unfortunately in Canada there aren't at the moment a lot of registered dietitians that are comfortable with low carb, high fat diets, and so don't recommend them. So that's part of the work that I do through what's called Canadian Clinicians for Therapeutic Nutrition. Is what we want to do is we want to start training healthcare professionals, so physicians, nurses, registered dietitians, in what is a low-carb, high-fat diet and how do you design one well for clients, for patients. Right.
Well, and so, we're going to probably wrap up pretty quick here, but the reason this is so important to me, I think, is my dad passed away last year in February, and he passed away of a heart attack, and he also had, I think, type 2 diabetes. And
what was his body shape like?
A bit like he had a belly, and he hated cooking, and so he would always grab things out of a box, things that were processed, and I always was trying to get him to kind of do fresher stuff. But I think, like you said, like there has to be more conversation about it. There has to be more awareness, knowledge, resources available to people, because I think, like we've just talked about, society has shifted, and it's acceptable to get processed food and it's it's there, so it can't be that bad for me, right? But it's like it really is, and these lobbies kind of help reinforce that. That's right. So as we wrap up here, can I add two more things? Of course, yeah.
So I think I fully agree. I think there's a real issue, and I work in a hospital, so I mean I kind of think of the medicine that I do as the Band-Aids. We're putting Band-Aids on things. It's taken a lifetime to develop these illnesses, these issues, and then we're trying to kind of put Band-Aids on them at very high cost. And they're in our current drugs and surgery. In our current healthcare environment, there is really virtually no funding for preventative care. So I would love to see more money dedicated to preventative care, to teaching people, what is healthy food and how to prepare healthy food, and catching people early. The second comment you made, and I think it's just really interesting, is about your father having a belly. And that is when we carry fat. So people talk about, I don't know if men are as familiar with this, but this apple versus pear. So people carry their fat around the middle, and we call that apple, or pear, where they, and that's more of a, they call it a gynecoid, more of a female. You carry it on your waist and hips. And we know for sure that the fat carried around the belly, what's called visceral means inside, so the fat inside is the very harmful fat. That's fat that ends up in your liver, it ends up around your heart, it ends up around your bowel, around your intestines. And that fat, so I could go on forever, but that fat actually secretes, well, all fat secretes hormones, but that fat, that visceral fat, secretes very harmful hormones. And those are the hormones that end up causing heart disease, end up causing diabetes. And so a very quick test that people can do, am I at high risk of this insulin resistance, is that you take a piece of string, it's called the string test. You take a piece of string and you get someone, you stick it under your foot, top of your head, how long, you measure yourself with the string. And then what you do is you fold that string in half and you try and tie it around your waist. And if it reaches, you're fine. Your waist circumference is less than half of your height. But if you can't get that string around your waist, you're at risk for all these diseases. And so, and you look around, I mean, I'm trying to remember the numbers. I have the American numbers, but the Canadian, in the US, 40% of people have obesity. That's a BMI over 30, and 70% have a BMI over 25. So that's considered, overweight and obesity. And Canada's probably very similar. Yeah. So a lot of people are walking around and wouldn't be able to get that string around their waist. So I think that's a really interesting test. And if you can't get that string around your waist, it's time to make some dietary changes.
Now, just quickly before we wrap up, resources. Where do people find the best resources? I know you mentioned a couple books, but
yeah. So so low carb, high fat resources, I would say I have two favorites. One is the Diet Doctor website. So that's www.dietdoctor.com, one word. There's a ton of information there. Another one of my favorites, this is for people specifically with diabetes, but my favorite scientist, his name is Dr. Steve Phinney, and he's been doing low-carb research for a long time. He's the godfather of low-carb, and he's part of a company that's called Virta Health, and they are treating patients with type 2 diabetes, and that website is www.virtahealth, VIRTA health.com.
Wicked. Well, yeah, I know you got to get running here. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
This has been awesome. Unfortunately, Joanne obviously wasn't able to join us today, but she will be back next week, and I don't know what we're going to be talking about. But again, thank you so much, Dr. Berchuk.
My pleasure.
And yeah, awesome.